Hi there, this is Pastor Ben of Grow Point Dumaguete, and today I just want to share something from God's Word in connection with our message last Sunday with our series Staying Strong in Difficult Times. And last Sunday we talked about God's sovereignty, God being this chief being with supreme power and authority that is in full control within His creation, and everything that happens is really under the rule and the authority of God. It's either directly, done by God, or it's something that God allows to happen. And we talked about Joseph as an illustration of God's sovereignty. And I'm not going to go through the entire story. We know the story of Joseph, but I do want to highlight some things about Joseph's life that may help us to stay strong in difficult times. This might be encouraging for us, because I realize that in difficult times it is not easy to stay strong. On the contrary, it is easier for us to be angry, even at God, and to be angry at others around us, to be bitter, to be anxious and be worried and be overcome with fear. And that happens because we realize that in difficult situations we are no longer in control and we are out of our comfort zones. And so we tend to blame others, and we tend to be, very, very sensitive and irritable. And it's just hard to live with someone who is worried and anxious and who is angry and bitter. It can be easy to blame God. I want to highlight that. And it can be easy to blame others around us whom we think are responsible and are the reasons why we find ourselves in difficult situations, but not Joseph. I would imagine that when his brothers, threw him in the pit and eventually sold him to slavery with Ishmaelites, I believe it was very hard for him. I think that was a difficult time in the life of Joseph. And we catch up the story in chapter 39 of Genesis. He ended up, to become a slave to an Egyptian named Potiphar. He was an officer of the Pharaoh and the captain of the guard. And Potiphar, interestingly, noticed something in Joseph. Let me read in chapter 39, verse 2. The Bible says that the Lord was with Joseph. That's probably the most important phrase in this story. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And verse 3 says this, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And so, because of that, Joseph found favor in the eyes of his master, and Potiphar made him the overseer of everything in his house. And so that was a blessing for Joseph. God began to bless him. Of course, everything that happened in Joseph's life up until this point was part of God's plan. But in the midst of blessings, it is easy for us to forget about God. It is easy for us to deviate from His plan. It is easy for us to fall into sin. In fact, a lot of temptations in life comes after great victories, and when we receive blessings after blessings after blessings, and temptations will come. And that was true in the life of Joseph. So after he was promoted, and the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field, according to chapter 39, verse 5 of Genesis, Potiphar's wife came to tempt him to fall into sin. And she was tempting him to lie with her. But verse 8 of chapter 39, he refused and said to his master's wife, let me read this. Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I, listen to this, do this great wickedness and sin against God? Now notice that. To Joseph, to lie with his master's wife was not just an offense against his master. To Joseph, it was sin and great wickedness against God. And of course, we can learn that Joseph remained faithful to God. He kept walking with the Lord even with everything that he had to go through in life so far. He remained faithful and he kept his faith in the Lord. And now we know the story. The wife of Potiphar made up a story, an attempted rape, she said. And because of that, Potiphar was so angry and threw Joseph into the prison. And then in verse 21, again, this beautiful phrase, listen to this. But the Lord was with Joseph. And the Lord continued to show his mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper in the prison. And again, Joseph became the person in charge in the prison. So he became the person in charge in Potiphar's house, his master. Now in the prison cell, he became the man in charge of the prisoners. And up until this point, we can see how God is preparing Joseph for what's going to be his role in life. But here's the thing. When we receive blessings, it is easy for us to give up seeking God's will for our life. We get contented and we think that, this is the life that I want to live. I mean, if you go back to where his situation in the house of Potiphar, I mean, he was in charge of everything. And, there was nothing that was not, there was nothing that Potiphar kept from him except his wife. And to a lot of people, even Christians, I mean, what else can I look for? I mean, I'm in Egypt, I'm in this house, I'm in charge. It was as if he owned the house anyway. He can eat anything he wants, he can do anything he wants except touching his master's wife. And when we find ourselves in that situation, it's easy for us to get contented and forget about seeking God's will. I mean, this probably is it. This is probably God's will for my life. But my dear friends, that was not obviously God's will for him. God was just preparing him. And notice this. Everywhere Joseph ended, he ended up to be the second man in authority because God is preparing him for something. In the prison cell, he became the in charge of the prisoners. Of course, we know the story. As we related last Sunday, he became acquainted with the butler and the chief baker who had dreams. And then Joseph, by God's help, interpreted that dream for them. And then one of them would be killed, and one of them would be restored. And the one that was restored remembered Joseph when Pharaoh had a dream he could not interpret. And as we related in our message last Sunday, God used Joseph to interpret the Pharaoh's dream and gave him recommendations on how to prepare for the famine. And cut the story short, when the Pharaoh was impressed, Joseph became the second man in authority. And this was all part of God's plan. So that in the end, when his brothers, after the death of their father, were so afraid of what Joseph might do to them, they presented themselves and they said, we will be your slaves. But listen to Joseph. I read it last Sunday. I want to say it again. In verse 19, Joseph said to his brothers, "Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God?" And here Joseph acknowledged that God was in this since the very beginning. God was the one orchestrating everything that had happened, and everything that happened in his life was part of God's plan and God's purpose for him. And so even in difficult times, when he was sold in slavery, when he was falsely accused, when he was in prison, Joseph kept his eye on God, and his heart remained devoted to him. His heart remained loyal to God. He kept his relationship with God, and he completely surrendered his life to him. His life was an offering, and that was his life of worship for the Lord. And then in verse 20 he says, as for you, you meant evil against me. You planned evil against me. You wanted to do something bad towards me. But God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. So Joseph was saying this was part of God's plan. This is God's plan for my life. This was part of God's purpose for me. You had evil intentions. God allowed that because He's sovereign. He's in full control. But let me end, by this question. What could have happened, and how, I wonder how the story would end up if Joseph became bitter against his brothers and against God. If he was bitter against God, my suspicion is that he could have easily fallen into immorality with Potiphar's wife, and then they could have kept it their secret, and he could have enjoyed the goods in the house, living in the house, eating what he wanted to eat, and have the wife, right? And the story would have been different. God's plan would not have been, accomplished in and through his life. And we would not know Joseph as the Joseph here in this story. It would have been completely different had Joseph not stayed strong in difficult times. Brothers and sisters, that's why it is very important to stay strong in difficult times. Stay connected to God. Keep pursuing God, even when we are not in control, and even when, we are out of our comfort zones, even when things become so uncomfortable, and, we are so uncertain of what's going to happen next. Remember this. Our God is in full control because He's sovereign and He has a plan. It's easier said than done, but all that we should do is trust in Him completely. Trust the God who is in control. Trust our God who has a purpose and plan. And in the end, we will appreciate what the outcome will be. So I hope that, you are challenged by these thoughts, and I hope that you will stay strong in difficult times. God bless you.